The Duke did not beg, not when London's elite turned their backs, not when Parliament stripped his titles in a single brutal session, not when the woman he'd destroyed empires for walked away without looking back. Cedric Thorne stood alone in the ruins of Ashford Hall while creditors hammered notices to his gates, and the only sound louder than their fists was the silence where power used to live. But here's what they didn't understand about men built from ash and fury. You don't kill what's already learned to burn. Stay with me, because what comes next isn't redemption, it's reckoning. The last candle in the east drawing room guttered and died sometime after midnight. Cedric didn't bother replacing it. Darkness suited bankrupt dukes better than gaslight anyway. He stood by the rain-streaked windows of what used to be England's most formidable estate, watching carriage lamps disappear down the long gravel drive. The Harrisons. Gone. Before them, the Ashworths, the Pembrokes, the Westfields. Every titled family that had once groveled for his attention now fled Ashford Hall like rats from a plague ship. The irony tasted like copper on his tongue. 6 months ago, men crossed oceans for his approval. Now they crossed streets to avoid his shadow. Behind him, the drawing room bore the scars of systematic dismantling. Empty rectangles marked where portraits had hung before creditors seized them. Bare walls where silk paper had been stripped and sold. The massive oak desk his grandfather commissioned sat violated in the corner. Drawers yanked open and emptied of anything valuable. They'd taken everything except the furniture too heavy to move. And the ghosts. Those apparently had no resale value. Cedric poured the last measure of brandy from a crystal decanter that somehow survived the liquidation. The amber liquid caught what little moonlight penetrated the storm clouds. He didn't toast, didn't savor, just drank it like medicine while rain hammered the glass. Footsteps echoed through the stripped hallway. Heavy, deliberate, not a servant's anxious shuffle. The door opened without ceremony. Marcus Hayward entered like a man walking into a tomb. His dark coat dripped rainwater onto hardwood that would never be polished again. He'd been Cedric's solicitor for 8 years. His expression suggested he'd aged 20 in the last 6 months. "You didn't answer my letters," Marcus said. "I didn't read them." "Then you don't know about the final audit." "I know enough." Cedric set the empty glass on the window ledge with surgical precision. "They found new debts I allegedly accrued. Contracts bearing my signature that I never signed. Witnesses who swore under oath I'd promised payments I never authorized." Marcus said nothing. Cedric turned from the window. His reflection in the remaining mirror showed what 6 months of systematic destruction looked like on a man who'd once controlled half of London's financial infrastructure. Sharper, harder, hollowed out in places that used to hold something resembling humanity. "Say it," Cedric commanded quietly. "The estate is forfeit. All of it. The house, the lands, the mining operations in Wales, the shipping contracts. Parliament seized everything under the new Insolvency Act. Convenient legislation. Passed 3 weeks after your fall, retroactively applied." Cedric's jaw tightened. Lord Pemberton's work. Among others, the coalition that brought you down made certain you'd never rebuild. Marcus moved deeper into the room, avoiding the empty spaces where furniture used to stand. "They're calling it justice for decades of ruthless business practices. They're calling it revenge. That too." The silence stretched between them like a blade. Marcus finally broke it. "There's more. There always is. Lady Isolde returned to London last week, Ocht. Something cold and sharp twisted behind Cedric's ribs. He didn't move. Didn't react. Men who'd survived what he'd survived learned to master their faces before they learned to walk. "I see. She's staying with the Westfields. Apparently Lord Westfield is courting her publicly now. The Times ran an announcement 2 days ago. They're calling it the romance of the season." Marcus pulled a folded newspaper from his coat. "Society is celebrating her escape from your influence. She's been giving interviews about her liberation." Cedric took the paper with steady hands. The headline alone was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. "Beauty freed from the beast, Lady Isolde speaks on her years with the fallen Duke." He didn't need to read the article. He could imagine every practiced word, every strategic tear, every calculated moment of vulnerability designed to transform her from conspirator to victim. She'd always been brilliant at performance. "She's claiming you coerced her into the relationship," Marcus continued, that you used financial manipulation and intimidation to keep her trapped at Ashford Hall. Parliament is considering formal charges. Of course they are. Cadric, she helped orchestrate my destruction. The words came out flat, empty of emotion. She fed Pemberton inside information for 9 months. She falsified documents. She seduced my business partners and extracted leverage while sharing my bed. He set the newspaper on the window ledge beside the empty glass. And now she's rewriting history to make herself the victim of my villainy. Can you prove any of that? I had proof. It was in my private study safe, along with documentation of Pemberton's embezzlement and Thornwell's fraud. But the night they raided Ashford Hall, the safe was already empty. Kedrick's voice remained absolutely level. Someone with access had cleaned it out hours before the authorities arrived. Marcus closed his eyes. She had a key. She had everything. The rain intensified against the windows. Thunder rolled across the Yorkshire moors like artillery fire from a war that never really ended. Kedrick had built his fortune by understanding one fundamental truth about human nature. Everyone could be bought. Not always with money, sometimes with security, sometimes with affection, sometimes with the promise of power they'd never achieve alone. He thought Isolde wanted partnership. Turned out she wanted his throne. What will you do? Marcus asked. Nothing. Nothing? There's nothing left to do. The estate is gone. My titles are stripped. My allies have abandoned me. Fighting Parliament would require resources I no longer possess and allies who no longer exist. Kedrick turned back to the window. I've lost. The word felt foreign in his mouth. Heavy. Strange. Like a language he'd never learned to speak. Marcus stared at him with something that looked disturbingly like pity. You should leave England. Start over in America. I have contacts in... No. Kedrick. I said no. His reflection in the glass showed nothing. No rage. No despair. Just emptiness where ambition used to burn. Running suggests I still care about survival. You don't? I'm a dead man who hasn't stopped breathing yet. There's a difference. Marcus looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, he set a leather portfolio on the bare floor. These are the final documents, transfer papers, surrender agreements. They need your signature by week's end or they'll send bailiffs. Let them come. They'll arrest you. Good. At least prison has walls. Marcus turned toward the door, then stopped. His voice went quiet, almost gentle. The tone you used with men standing on ledges. She's not worth this. Kedrick didn't respond. After Marcus left, the silence returned. Thicker than before. Heavy enough to crush bone. Kedrick stood in the darkness of his ruined drawing room and felt nothing. That was the worst part. Not rage. Not grief. Not even hatred. Just vast, terrible nothing where his life used to be. Morning came gray and cold. Kedrick woke in the chair by the window where he'd finally collapsed around dawn. His body ached with the particular stiffness that came from sleeping in furniture not designed for it. The rain had stopped. Weak sunlight filtered through clouds the color of old bruises. Ashford Hall looked worse in daylight. The grounds that used to employ 30 gardeners now resembled abandoned battlefield. Overgrown hedges, weed-choked pathways. The fountain in the center courtyard had stopped working months ago. Green scum covered the surface of standing water. A single carriage sat near the main gates. Not one of his. Those had been sold off in the first wave of liquidation. This was government issue. Black lacquer, official seal on the door. Kedrick watched 3 men in dark coats emerge and approach the house. Bailiffs, probably. Or Parliament's enforcement officers. Didn't matter which. They all came for the same thing eventually. His surrender. He didn't bother changing clothes, didn't shave, didn't attempt to resurrect the immaculate appearance that used to be armor. Let them see what they'd made. The men were already inside the entrance hall when Kedrick descended the main staircase. They turned at the sound of his footsteps. 2 young officers flanking an older man with silver hair and a face built from granite and judgment. Lord Chancellor Beaumont, second most powerful man in Parliament, first most responsible for the legislation that destroyed him. Your Grace, Beaumont said with exquisite mockery. Or should I say, Mr. Thorne? The titles were formally revoked yesterday. Kedrick stopped 3 steps from the bottom, high enough to look down. low enough to seem compliant. I assume you're here to expedite my removal. Actually, I'm here to discuss terms. That penetrated the numbness. Kedrick studied Beaumont's expression. Politicians didn't make personal visits to ruined nobles unless they wanted something that couldn't be requested through official channels. What terms? He asked carefully. May we speak privately? Ishi. The servants are gone. The house is empty. Privacy isn't a concern. Beaumont nodded to his officers. They withdrew to the courtyard without argument. Professional, efficient. The kind of men who followed orders without needing explanations. When they were alone, Beaumont moved deeper into the entrance hall. His gaze swept across the stripped walls and empty pedestals. Quite thorough, weren't they? You authorized the seizure yourself. I authorized what was necessary to satisfy public demand for accountability. Beaumont stopped beside where a massive portrait of Kedrick's father used to hang. You made many enemies during your rise to power, Mr. Thorne. Those enemies were very patient, very strategic, and when the opportunity finally presented itself, they struck with precision. Kedrick descended the remaining steps. I'm aware of the choreography. I helped design similar operations myself. Yes, that's why I'm here. The admission landed between them like a chess piece moved into position. Kedrick's analytical mind, the part that survived everything else, began processing angles. You need something. We have a situation, Beaumont corrected, one that requires particular expertise, the kind of expertise you demonstrated repeatedly during your years of dominance. I'm bankrupt and powerless. What could I possibly offer? Intelligence, strategy, ruthlessness. Beaumont's expression remained neutral, professional. There's a conspiracy forming against the crown, multiple noble families working in coordination. We've identified the key players, but we can't penetrate their inner circle. They're too cautious, too sophisticated. So use your intelligence services. We have. They've failed. These conspirators learned their methods from someone. Beaumont's gaze sharpened. They learned them from you. Understanding crystallized. You want me to infiltrate my own former network. We want you to do what you do best. Manipulate, deceive, destroy from within. Beaumont pulled a sealed envelope from his coat. In exchange, we'll restore your titles, return your properties, erase the criminal charges. You'll have everything back, except my reputation. Oh, reputations can be rebuilt, especially with crown support. Kedrick stared at the envelope. Revenge wrapped in official seals and government authority. Everything he'd lost offered back on a silver platter. The cost was simply his soul. Again. What makes you think I'd help the people who destroyed me? His voice came out quiet, dangerous. Because you have nothing left to lose, and because deep down, you're the same predator you've always been. You've just been starved for 6 months. Beaumont set the envelope on the marble banister. Hunt them, destroy them, prove you're still the most dangerous man in England. And if I refuse, then you'll rot in debtor's prison by next week. We'll make certain of it. The ultimatum hung between them. Clear, unambiguous, brutal in its simplicity. Kedrick looked at the envelope, then at Beaumont, then at the ruins of everything he'd built. 6 months ago, he would have seen this as opportunity, a chance to reclaim power, to prove his dominance, to make his enemies bleed for their betrayal. Now? Now he just felt tired. You should leave, Kedrick said. Beaumont's expression flickered. Surprise. You're refusing. I'm done playing these games. Find another monster to do your hunting. Mr. Thorne, get out of my house. His voice remained flat, empty. What's left of it? Beaumont studied him for a long moment, searching for weakness, for leverage, for the angle that would change refusal to compliance. He found nothing, because there was nothing left to find. You're making a mistake, Beaumont said finally. I've made nothing but mistakes for 20 years. One more won't matter. The Lord Chancellor retrieved his envelope, adjusted his coat, moved toward the door with the careful dignity of powerful men unaccustomed to rejection. He paused in the threshold. Lady Isolde will be at the Pemberton Ball next week. First official appearance with Lord Westfield. Society is calling it a triumph of true love over darkness. Beaumont's tone carried surgical precision. Thought you should know. Then he left. Kedrick stood alone in his entrance hall, listening to the carriage pull away. The numbness had cracked. Something else was leaking through. Not rage, not yet. Just the cold, patient fury of a predator that had finally remembered what teeth were for. The letter arrived 3 days later. Heavy cream paper, Isolde's handwriting, her signature perfume still clinging to the envelope. Kedrick stared at it for 10 minutes before opening it. My dearest Kedrick, I hope this letter finds you well, though I confess I worry about your circumstances. Despite everything, I wanted you to know that I never intended for things to end this way. What happened between us was complicated, beautiful in its own dark fashion, but ultimately destructive. I found peace now. Real peace. The kind that comes from living without fear, without walking on knives every moment, without wondering which version of you would appear each morning. Lord Westfield is a good man, gentle, kind, everything I needed but couldn't articulate while trapped in your gravity. I'm writing to inform you that we're engaged. The wedding is set for autumn. I wanted you to hear it from me rather than read it in the papers. I hope you'll find your own peace someday, whatever that looks like for someone like you. With genuine care, Isolde Kedrick read it twice, then a third time. The words were perfect, practiced, designed to wound while maintaining plausible deniability, each sentence a needle inserted with surgical precision. Someone like you. He set the letter on his desk beside Marcus's legal documents and the government's sealed offer. 3 paths. Surrender to ruin, accept servitude to the crown. Or, Kedrick walked to the empty library where books used to line walls floor to ceiling. The room echoed now, hollow. Most of the volumes had been sold, but he'd hidden certain materials in a hollowed section behind where his father's collection stood. The false panel opened to his touch. Inside were documents even Isolde hadn't found. Letters, ledgers, photographs. Evidence he'd collected over years of careful manipulation and strategic blackmail. Insurance against exactly this scenario. He thought he was too powerful to ever need them. He'd been wrong about many things. Kedrick spread the materials across the dusty floor and began to plan. Not revenge. Revenge was emotional. Reactive. The weapon of men who'd lost control. This was something else. This was the resurrection of a predator who'd finally stopped pretending to be tame. He worked through the night, mapping connections, identifying pressure points, building the architecture of a campaign that would make his previous ruthlessness look like mercy. Dawn found him surrounded by papers covered in notes written in dead languages his tutors had taught him decades ago. Codes he'd developed, systems only he understood. The man who'd stood in this library 6 months ago was dead. The thing organizing these documents was something older, harder. The version of Kedrick Thorne that had clawed his way up from nothing before titles and estates softened his edges. Somewhere in the ruined house, a door slammed. Kedrick didn't look up. He was busy designing the end of everyone who'd underestimated what remained when you stripped a predator of everything except his capacity for violence. They thought they'd destroyed him. They'd only freed him from the last restraints humanity provided. The difference would become clear soon enough. Outside, storm clouds gathered over Ashford Hall like an audience waiting for the show to begin. The architect of his own destruction sat among papers that mapped every weakness in London's power structure and felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Clarity, not hope. Hope was for men who still believed in redemption. This was colder, sharper, the absolute certainty that came from finally understanding what you were willing to become. Kedrick worked for 3 more hours as pale sunlight crawled across the library floor. His hands moved with mechanical precision, sorting documents, cross-referencing dates, building the skeleton of a campaign designed to fracture the coalition that destroyed him from the inside out. The strategy was elegant in its brutality. He wouldn't attack them publicly, wouldn't rage against the machinery of his own dismantling. That would be expected. Defensive, the flailing of a broken man trying to reclaim lost glory. Instead, he would do what he'd always done best. Infiltrate, corrupt, turn their own weapons against them until they destroyed each other while he watched from the shadows, starting with the person who knew him best. The person who taught him that love was just another form of leverage waiting to be exploited. Isolde. Footsteps echoed in the entrance hall, Kedrick didn't look up. Only one person still had access to Ashford Hall. Only one person would dare enter unannounced. Marcus appeared in the library doorway. His expression shifted when he saw the papers spread across the floor. The coded notes. The systematic documentation of years' worth of carefully collected ammunition. He didn't speak immediately. Smart man. Finally, "You're going after them." "I'm correcting an imbalance." Kedrick set down the letter he'd been analyzing. Lord Pemberton's correspondence with a French banking house, dated 6 months before the public accusations began. They thought destroying me would be the end of the story. They were wrong. "Kedrick, if Parliament discovers your—" "Parliament isn't my concern anymore. They made their position clear when Beaumont walked out of this house." He gestured to the documents. "These people taught me something valuable. When you burn a man's life to ash, you better make certain there's nothing left that remembers how to ignite." Marcus moved closer, his legal mind already calculating risks, measuring consequences. "What are you planning?" "To become what they always feared I was." "Which is?" "Uncontrollable." The words settled between them like a verdict. Marcus crouched beside the papers. His eyes scanned the names, the dates, the intricate web of connections Kedrick had spent the night documenting. His face went pale. "These are government officials, members of Parliament, Crown advisors." "Yes. If you move against them, they'll hang you for treason." "Only if they catch me, and I learned from the best." Kedrick's voice remained absolutely flat. "They spent 6 months systematically dismantling everything I built. Now I'm going to show them what I built it from." Marcus stood, paced to the empty bookshelves, turned back. "This isn't strategy. This is suicide." "No, suicide is passive. This is execution." Kedrick rose from the floor, joints protesting from hours of stillness. "They want me to disappear quietly, to accept my destruction with dignity, to become a cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties about the dangers of ambition." He moved to the window where morning light cut through dirty glass in geometric patterns. "But I've never been good at disappearing." "Wow." Marcus studied him for a long moment, searching for something. Sanity, probably. Some evidence that the man he'd served for 8 years still existed beneath the hollow-eyed creature standing in ruins. He wouldn't find it. That man died the moment Isolde's letter arrived. "I can't be part of this," Marcus said quietly. "I know." "If they discover I had knowledge of, then deny everything. Tell them I went mad. Tell them grief and bankruptcy destroyed my reason. Tell them whatever keeps you safe." Kedrick turned from the window. "I'm not asking you to follow me into this." "Then what are you asking?" "Eek. Nothing. I'm releasing you from any obligation to my service. As of this moment, you're no longer my solicitor." He pulled a document from the scattered papers, a formal dissolution of their professional relationship, already signed. "Your reputation remains intact. Your career continues. We never had this conversation." Marcus took the paper with shaking hands. "Read it twice." "You planned this." "I plan everything." "Shut." "No. You used to plan everything. Now you're just—" Marcus gestured helplessly at the evidence of Kedrick's transformation. "What happened to you?" "Evolution." Kedrick returned to his papers. 6 months ago, I believed power came from control, from maintaining the appearance of invulnerability, from never showing weakness. He selected another document, a bank statement showing Lord Westfield's gambling debts. But they stripped all that away, and underneath they found something much worse than a ruthless duke. "What?" "A ruthless man without a title." Marcus left without another word. Kedrick heard the front door close, heard the carriage pull away, heard the last connection to his former life disappear into the distance. Good. Dead men didn't need lawyers, they needed weapons. "Boss, yeah?" The Pemberton Ball was exactly the kind of ostentatious display of wealth that made revolutionaries sharpen guillotines. Crystal chandeliers the size of carriages, gold leaf covering every architectural surface, champagne flowing like rivers, while London's poor starved 3 miles away in rookeries the aristocracy pretended didn't exist. Kedrick watched from across the street, standing in shadows between 2 buildings. He'd arrived hours before the first guests, mapped the exits, identified the security, memorized the servant rotations. Old habits, useful habits. Carriages lined the circular drive. Women in silk and diamonds, Men in formal evening wear that cost more than most families earned in years, all of them flowing into Pemberton House like blood cells rushing toward a heart that should have stopped beating decades ago. He'd received no invitation, obviously. Didn't need one. The service entrance remained where it had always been, poorly guarded, poorly monitored. The weakness in every great house was the assumption that servants were invisible. Kedrick had built a fortune exploiting that assumption. Tonight, he'd use it to begin rebuilding his capacity for destruction. He waited until the main event started, until the ballroom filled with London's elite celebrating their victory over the fallen Duke, until the music swelled and attention focused inward on the spectacle of society performing for itself. Then he moved. The service entrance opened to his touch, unlocked. Amateur security for professionals who'd grown complacent in their dominance. He slipped inside wearing clothes stolen from a carriage house. Simple black, forgettable. The uniform of men who existed to serve without being seen. The kitchen buzzed with controlled chaos. Cooks shouting orders. Servants rushing between rooms carrying trays of delicacies that would be half-eaten and discarded. Steam. Heat. The particular energy of people working themselves to exhaustion so the wealthy could pretend effort didn't exist. No one looked at him. No one questioned his presence. He was simply another shadow moving through spaces designed to hide the machinery that kept luxury functioning. Kedrick navigated the servant corridors with the confidence of someone who'd studied these buildings for years. Every great house followed similar architectural logic. Public spaces for display, private spaces for reality, and the narrow passages between them where servants moved like ghosts. He emerged on the second floor. Quieter here. The sounds of the ball below muted by thick carpets and heavy doors. This level housed the family's private chambers, the places guests were never meant to see. Lord Pemberton's study occupied the east corner. Kedrick had been inside it twice before, once for negotiations that made both men wealthier, once to deliver a warning that Pemberton pretended to heed but secretly ignored. The door was locked. It took him 40 seconds to bypass it using techniques learned from a housebreaker he'd once blackmailed into service. The lock clicked. The door swung open. He stepped inside and closed it behind him with the careful silence of men who understood sound traveled. Pemberton's study looked exactly like the man himself. Expensive, self-important, decorated with trophies proving status to anyone who entered. Kedrick moved to the desk, pulled open drawers with gloved hands, found exactly what he expected. Correspondence, financial records, the everyday evidence of a man who believed his position made him untouchable. He photographed everything using a small camera purchased from a disgraced journalist who owed him favors. Systematic, thorough, each document captured, each piece of evidence preserved. But that wasn't why he came. The real target sat in the corner, a portrait of Pemberton's daughter, Catherine, 18 years old, beautiful in the way of girls who'd never faced consequence. Engaged to a minor lord with gambling problems and family connections that made the match strategically valuable. Kedrick studied the painting, memorized her face. Then he left the study as silently as he'd entered and descended back into the servant passages. The ballroom glittered below. He found a position near the gallery where shadows pooled and sight lines opened to the entire floor. From here he could observe without being observed, see without being seen. The entire architecture of his former life spread beneath him like a dissection. Lord Pemberton held court near the main staircase. Fat, satisfied, surrounded by sycophants laughing at jokes that weren't funny because wealth demanded performance. He'd gained weight since orchestrating Kedrick's destruction. Prosperity suited him. That would change. Lady Thornwell danced with a young officer. Her husband watched from the card room where men gathered to gamble and pretend they weren't terrified of their wives' influence. The Thornwells had turned against Kedrick first, before it was fashionable, before it was safe. He'd remember that. And there, entering from the West Gallery like a vision designed to wound, was Isolde. Kedrick's hands tightened on the railing. She wore ice blue silk that caught candlelight and transformed her into something ethereal, untouchable. Her dark hair was swept up in the current fashion, diamonds at her throat, the picture of refined beauty that London society worshipped. Lord Westfield walked beside her, tall, handsome in the soft way of men who'd never been tested. He touched her arm with careful possession, guided her through the crowd with the proud confidence of someone who'd won a prize. They stopped near the center of the ballroom. People swarmed immediately. Congratulations. Well wishes. Society celebrating the triumph of true love over darkness. Every face smiled. Every voice carried warmth. Kedrick watched Isolde accept their praise with perfect grace. Humble, grateful. The rescued maiden finally freed from the monster's tower. She'd always been an extraordinary liar. He studied her body language, the subtle tells he'd learned over 2 years of intimate proximity. She touched Westfield's arm, but her fingers didn't linger. She smiled, but her eyes scanned the crowd constantly, calculating, measuring, the same predatory awareness she'd hidden so carefully while playing the role of his devoted companion. She was hunting, just like she'd always been hunting. The realization settled over him like ice water. Isolde hadn't betrayed him for love, hadn't fled to safety, hadn't escaped to find peace. She'd simply upgraded to a better target. Westfield was heir to a shipping empire, softer than Kedrick, easier to manipulate, vulnerable in ways a paranoid duke had never been. Give her 5 years and she'd control everything, while Westfield played the role of doting husband, never understanding that his wife had turned him into a puppet. The same thing she'd almost accomplished with Kedrick, before he became suspicious and started hiding evidence. Brilliant, ruthless, exactly the kind of strategy he would have designed himself. Below him, the music shifted. Waltz. Couples moved to the floor and practiced synchronization. Westfield extended his hand. Isolde accepted with a smile that could launch ships or sink empires depending on her mood. They began to dance. Kedrick watched them circle the ballroom, watched London's elite celebrate the destruction they'd orchestrated together. Watched the woman he'd almost loved perform the same role with someone else that she'd performed with him. He felt nothing. No jealousy, no rage, no grief, just cold, clinical assessment of tactical weaknesses waiting to be exploited. The music swelled. Isolde turned in Westfield's arms, and for just a moment her eyes swept the gallery. She froze. Not obviously. The crowd wouldn't notice. Westfield didn't notice. But Kedrick saw the micro-expression flash across her face before control reasserted itself. Recognition. Fear. She'd seen him. Their eyes met across the ballroom, across the distance between the living and the dead, across the chasm of betrayal that no apology could ever bridge. Kedrick didn't move, didn't react, just held her gaze with the flat, empty stare of apex predators who'd finally stopped pretending to be domesticated. Isolde missed a step. Westfield caught her, asked if she was well. His voice carried concern, genuine care. The poor bastard actually loved her. She recovered instantly, smiled, blamed the champagne, let him guide her off the floor toward the refreshment tables. But she kept glancing back toward the gallery, searching the shadows, looking for the ghost she'd seen. Kedrick stepped deeper into darkness and disappeared. He'd accomplished what he came for. Isolde now knew he was hunting. Kimab. The next morning, society pages exploded with coverage of the Pemberton Ball. Photographs, gossip, detailed descriptions of every dress and scandal, and whispered rumor that made the aristocracy feel important. Buried on page 7 was a smaller item. Lord Pemberton's study had been broken into during the ball. Nothing stolen, nothing damaged. But papers had been disturbed, documents photographed. Security was investigating, but had no leads. Kedrick read the article over cold tea in what used to be Ashford Hall's breakfast room. Let them investigate. They wouldn't find anything. He'd been too careful, too practiced. And the message had been delivered exactly as intended. Your secrets aren't safe. Your walls aren't secure. I can reach you whenever I choose. He set down the newspaper and picked up the photographs he'd developed overnight in the makeshift darkroom he'd built in the basement. Clear images. Incriminating evidence. Lord Pemberton's financial relationship with a French banking house that specialized in moving money away from government oversight. Not illegal, but suspicious enough to warrant questions. Questions that would lead to other questions. Questions that would fracture the coalition that destroyed him. Kedrick organized the photographs into careful stacks. Then he began writing letters, anonymous letters, to rival noble families, to political opponents, to journalists hungry for scandal. Each letter contained just enough information to raise concerns without revealing the source. Each letter was designed to make powerful men paranoid about their allies. Paranoia was the first step toward self-destruction. He'd weaponized it before. He'd weaponize it again. A knock interrupted his work, not Marcus. Marcus wouldn't return. Kadrick moved to the entrance hall, opened the door. A young woman stood on the steps. Plain dress, practical shoes, dark hair pulled back severely. She held a leather satchel and wore the expression of someone who'd learned to survive in places where survival required specific skills. She extended a folded note. Kedrick took it. The paper was expensive, heavy, the kind used by people who could afford quality. Inside, written in elegant script, "You were seen. We should talk. Tonight. The Rose and Thorn. Come alone." No signature. Didn't need one. He recognized Isolde's handwriting immediately. Kedrick looked at the young woman who'd delivered the message. She met his eyes without flinching. Not a hired courier. Something else. Someone used to discretion, to moving information between people who couldn't meet openly. He handed her a coin, silver. More than the delivery warranted. She took it, disappeared into the morning fog without a word. Professional. Isolde had always surrounded herself with competent people. Kedrick returned to the breakfast room. Reread the note 3 times. Analyzing word choice. Tone, the implicit threat wrapped in invitation. You were seen. Acknowledgement of his presence at the ball. Confirmation that she recognized him. Warning that she wouldn't ignore the provocation. We should talk. Not we need to talk. Should. Softer. Suggesting mutual benefit rather than confrontation. Classic Isolde. Always framing aggression as cooperation. Come alone. The only genuine statement in the message. She wanted no witnesses, no evidence, just 2 predators in a room negotiating terms. The smart move was ignoring it. The strategic move was sending a refusal. The safe move was disappearing before she could marshal resources against him. Kedrick folded the note carefully. Then he began planning exactly how he'd walk into an obvious trap while making it serve his purposes instead of hers. The Rose and Thorn occupied a narrow building on the edge of Whitechapel, where respectable London dissolved into something older and more honest about human nature. Not a brothel. Not quite. The establishment catered to aristocrats who wanted privacy for activities they couldn't conduct in Mayfair. Gambling, affairs, negotiations that required deniability. The owner asked no questions, kept no records, and ensured absolute discretion for clients willing to pay premium prices. Kedrick had used it twice before, once to finalize a business arrangement involving blackmail, once to end a relationship that had become politically inconvenient. The irony wasn't lost on him. He arrived after dark, alone as instructed, wearing clothes that wouldn't attract attention in this part of the city. His weapons were invisible but readily accessible, a blade in his boot, another at his wrist, and the small pistol that had saved his life during a previous negotiation with men who'd mistaken his civility for weakness. The entrance was lit by a single red lantern. He knocked 3 times. The door opened immediately. The proprietor, a thin man with the careful eyes of someone who'd survived by knowing when to look away, gestured him inside without speaking, led him up narrow stairs to the 3rd floor, stopped before a closed door, knocked twice. A woman's voice. "Come in." The proprietor departed silently. Kedrick opened the door. The room was small, private, furnished with the kind of deliberate luxury that suggested safety while providing none. A single window overlooked the street below. Escape route. He noted it automatically. Isolde sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace. She'd changed from the ballroom silk into something simpler, dark wool, practical. The clothes of someone preparing for violence rather than seduction. Smart. She understood what he'd become. 2 men flanked the doorway behind her. Large, professional. The kind of muscle money bought when you needed protection from people who knew how to kill quietly. Isolde gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit." Kedrick remained standing. "I prefer mobility." Cautious. Educated. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "You always were the most paranoid man I knew." Paranoia implies irrational fear. My concerns were validated 6 months ago. Fair point. She gestured again. "Please, sit. I didn't ask you here to hurt you." "No, you did that months ago. This is something else." Isolde's expression shifted, annoyance flickering beneath practiced control. She'd expected him broken, desperate, eager for any scrap of kindness from the woman who'd destroyed him. Instead, She got the version of Kaedric who'd stopped caring about survival and started caring about damage. He moved to the chair, sat with careful precision, hands visible, body language relaxed but ready. The posture of men who'd learned to fight in spaces where violence erupted without warning. The bodyguards tensed. Isolde raised a hand. "Stand down." They obeyed but didn't relax. Silence stretched between them. Kaedric waited. Let her open. Let her reveal what she needed. Basic negotiation tactics. The first person to speak usually lost. Finally, "You can't keep doing this." "Doing what?" "You know what? Breaking into Pemberton's study. Showing yourself at the ball. Whatever you're planning." "I'm not planning anything. I'm a bankrupt former duke with no resources and no power. What could I possibly do?" "Don't." Her voice sharpened. "Don't play games with me. I know you better than anyone. I know exactly what you're capable of when someone takes something from you." "You're right. You do know me." Kaedric leaned forward slightly. "So you understand that what you took wasn't something. It was everything. My estate, my titles, my reputation, my future." His voice remained absolutely level. "Everything except my memory of how to dismantle people who underestimate what remains when you burn everything else away." Isolde's jaw tightened. "I didn't have a choice. Everyone has choices. Not when they're trapped." "Yes. You were never trapped. You were strategic." He gestured around the private room. "This meeting, these guards, the careful staging, you're not afraid I'll hurt you. You're afraid I'll expose you." "Expose what?" "Wait. That you're running the same operation on Westfield that you ran on me. That the broken girl seeking rescue is actually a predator wearing victim's clothing. That every tear was calculated. Every vulnerable moment was theater. Every word of love was just another form of manipulation." Her expression went cold. "You can't prove any of that." "I don't need to prove it. I just need to suggest it. Westfield is already in love, already vulnerable, already seeing you through the lens of romance. One whisper of doubt, one seed of suspicion, and he'll start noticing the patterns." Kaedric smiled without warmth. "You taught me that. How easy it is to destroy someone once you make them question what they thought was real." Isolde stood abruptly, moved to the window, stared down at the street below where fog pooled between buildings. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, softer, almost genuine. "I didn't want to destroy you, Kaedric. I wanted to survive you." "Same thing. No, you don't understand what it was like, living in Ashford Hall, walking on knives every day, never knowing which version of you would appear. The cold strategist, the possessive lover, the man who saw affection as weakness and vulnerability as invitation for control." She turned from the window. "You terrified me. I never hurt you. Not physically, but there are other ways to hurt people. You owned me, completely. Every thought, every choice, every moment of my life was subject to your approval. That's not love. That's captivity." The words landed precisely where she aimed them, the truth wrapped in exaggeration, the kernel of reality buried beneath performance. Kaedric had been possessive, had been controlling, had treated their relationship like a strategic asset to be managed, rather than a partnership to be nurtured. But he'd also been faithful, honest about his nature, clear about his expectations. She'd been none of those things. "So you chose to betray me rather than leave me," he said. "I chose to survive the only way you left available. By destroying everything I built. By destroying what you built on top of me." Her voice hardened again. "You want to paint me as the villain? Fine. I'll wear that. But don't pretend you were an innocent casualty. You created the environment that made betrayal the only rational response." Rational. Kaedric tasted the word. "Is that what you tell yourself? That it was rational to seduce me, to extract information, to conspire with my enemies while sharing my bed, to watch me fall and then write letters about how you finally found peace?" "Yes." No hesitation, no apology. "Because the alternative was spending the rest of my life as your possession, beautiful, expensive, completely powerless." They stared at each other across the small room, two predators recognizing each other. No more pretense, no more performance, just the cold clarity of people who'd stopped lying to themselves about what they were. Isolde spoke first. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to disappear, leave England, start over somewhere else. I'll provide money, resources, whatever you need to rebuild far away from here. You want to buy my absence. I want to prevent a war neither of us can win. Oh, you're wrong. Kedrick stood. You might not win, but I've already lost everything. That makes me significantly more dangerous than you understand. Then what do you want? The question hung between them. Kedrick moved toward the door. The bodyguard shifted, hands moving toward weapons hidden beneath coats. He stopped, turned back to face the woman who'd taught him that love was just another form of warfare. I want you to feel what I felt. When everything you believed was real turned out to be carefully constructed lies. When the person you trusted most became the architect of your destruction. When you realized too late that vulnerability was the weapon you handed your enemy. His voice remained quiet, absolute. I want you to watch Westfield look at you the way I looked at you in that final moment. Before security dragged me from Ashford Hall, when I understood everything between us had been theater. Isolde's face went pale. That's not rational? Kedrick smiled, cold, empty. No, but neither was what you did to me. Sometimes the only response to betrayal is making certain the betrayer understands consequences. He left before she could respond. The bodyguards didn't try to stop him. Outside, fog had thickened into near-solid walls. London disappeared into gray nothing. Perfect weather for ghosts and men who no longer cared about being seen. Kedrick walked into the darkness knowing he'd just declared war. Not the political kind. The personal kind. The kind that ended with one person destroyed and the other hollow from the cost of destruction. Behind him, in the small room above the rose and thorn, Isolde stood at the window watching his shadow disappear. Her hands shook. Not from fear, from recognition. She'd created this, unleashed this, turned a controlled predator into something wild and targeted, and now there was no way to stop what came next except to destroy him completely before he destroyed her. The war had begun. Both sides understood the stakes. Only one would survive. The war Kedrick declared that night in the fog wasn't the kind fought with armies or public declarations. It was surgical, intimate. The kind of violence that happened in shadows while society danced under chandeliers, pretending civilization had tamed the animal underneath. He spent the next 2 weeks mapping Isolde's new life with the same methodical precision he'd once used to build his fortune. Every routine, every ally, every weakness in the fortress she was constructing around Lord Westfield. The work kept him functional, kept the void at bay, kept him from examining too closely what he'd become in the months since his fall. The photographs from Pemberton's study had already begun their work. Anonymous letters delivered to strategic targets. Whispers planted in the right ears. Small fractures appearing in the coalition that destroyed him. Nothing traceable, nothing obvious. Just the slow erosion of trust that happened when powerful men started questioning whether their allies were truly loyal or simply waiting for opportunity. Kedrick operated from Ashford Hall like a general commanding troops from ruins. The estate was scheduled for final seizure in 3 weeks. Until then, it remained his base, his sanctuary, his tomb. He'd grown comfortable with ghosts. They made better company than the living anyway. On the 15th night after the meeting at the Rose and Thorn, everything changed. The knock came at 2 a.m, sharp, urgent, the rhythm of someone who needed entry immediately and didn't care about propriety. Kedrick descended to the entrance hall, wearing clothes he'd slept in, or tried to sleep in. Sleep had become theoretical lately, something other people did while he planned campaigns against enemies who'd learned to fear the dark. He opened the door. Catherine Pemberton stood on the steps. Lord Pemberton's daughter, the girl from the portrait in the study. 18 years old and looking significantly less composed than oil paint suggested. Her hair was disheveled, her dress mud-stained. She'd been running, or hiding, possibly both. She met his eyes with the desperate courage of people who'd exhausted all other options. I need your help. Kedrick studied her for 3 seconds, calculating, analyzing, searching for the trap this obviously represented. Why would I help you? Because my father destroyed you, and I can prove he did it using forged documents and bribed witnesses. Her voice shook but didn't break. I have evidence, real evidence, enough to overturn everything Parliament ruled against you. The words landed like artillery. Kedrick's mind spun through possibilities, scenarios. The 100 different ways this could be manipulation designed to finish what Isolde started. But Catherine wasn't Isolde. She was younger, raw, the kind of desperate that came from genuine fear rather than strategic performance. He stepped aside. "Come in." She entered quickly, glanced behind her at the empty drive, expecting pursuit. When none materialized, some of the tension left her shoulders. Kedrick led her to what remained of the drawing room, poured water from a pitcher that should have contained wine, but poverty had simplified his options, handed her the glass. She drank like someone who'd been running for hours. He waited. Let her catch her breath. Let her decide how much truth she was willing to offer. Finally, "My father is planning something terrible. Your father plans many terrible things. You'll need to be more specific." "He's arranging my marriage to Lord Wickham. The contract is already signed. The ceremony is scheduled for next month." Her hands trembled around the empty glass. "Lord Wickham is 57 years old. He's been married twice. Both wives died under suspicious circumstances. And he has a reputation for shh." She couldn't finish. Didn't need to. Kedrick understood immediately what kind of man Pemberton had sold his daughter to. "Why come to me?" he asked. "Why not flee? Find sanctuary somewhere your father's influence can't reach." "Because there is nowhere his influence can't reach. He controls judges, police, every authority I could appeal to for protection." Catherine set down the glass with shaking hands. "But you're different. You're already destroyed, already outside the system. You have nothing left to lose." "Is all I'm yipasi." "That's not a recommendation." "No. It's the only reason I trust you. Everyone else wants something from my father. Position, money, access. But you?" She looked at him with terrible clarity. "You want revenge, and I'm offering you the ammunition." Smart girl, smarter than her father deserved. Kedrick moved to the window, stared out at the grounds that would soon belong to someone else. Processing, calculating, measuring the risk against potential gain. "What evidence do you have?" Catherine pulled a leather satchel from beneath her cloak, set it on the table between them. "Letters, financial records, correspondence between my father and Lady Isolde planning your destruction 6 months before it began. Proof that the debts attributed to you were fabricated, that witnesses were paid to lie, that Parliament was manipulated using blackmail and bribery." Kedrick turned from the window, approached the satchel slowly. This was the moment. The trap would spring now if it was going to spring. Catherine would reveal herself as another weapon aimed at finishing him. The documents would be forgeries designed to implicate him further. He opened the satchel. Inside were papers, dozens of them, letters in Pemberton's handwriting, bank statements showing payments to men who'd testified against Kedrick, correspondence with Isolde discussing strategy, timeline, execution. The architecture of his destruction laid bare. Kedrick read 3 letters, then 5, then 10. Each one confirmed what he'd suspected but couldn't prove, that his fall hadn't been organic, hadn't been the natural consequence of accumulated enemies finally coordinating. It had been orchestrated, planned for months, executed with precision by people he'd trusted to varying degrees. The evidence was irrefutable, the kind of documentation that would overturn parliamentary rulings and restore everything they'd taken. He looked at Catherine. "Where did you get these?" "My father keeps everything. He's paranoid about protection. Believes documentation of his crimes gives him leverage if anyone turns against him." Her voice steadied, anger replacing fear. "He keeps it locked in a safe in his private study. I've known the combination since I was 12. He never changed it because he never imagined I'd betray him." "But you are betraying him." "I'm saving myself. There's a difference." "Fair point." Kedrick returned to the documents. His analytical mind was already processing implications. Strategic value. The 100 different ways this evidence could be weaponized. He could go to Parliament, present proof of Pemberton's manipulation, demand restoration of his titles and properties, watch his enemies scramble while the system they'd corrupted turned against them. Legal victory. Public vindication. Everything he'd lost returned with interest. But something felt wrong. The timing was too convenient. Catherine's appearance too perfectly aligned with his campaign against the coalition. The evidence too complete. Why now? He asked. You've known about your father's crimes for years. Why bring this to me tonight? Catherine's expression shifted, guilt flickering beneath determination. Because tonight, I overheard him planning something worse. Worse than destroying me? Worse than anything. She stood, paced to the empty fireplace, stared at cold ashes. He's organizing a coordinated attack on multiple targets, former allies who are becoming liabilities, people who know too much, who might testify if investigations begin. Who? Lord Ashworth, Lady Thornwell, Marcus Hayward. She turned to face him. Your former solicitor is on the list. They plan to make it look like an accident during a carriage robbery. Tomorrow night. Yet the floor dropped out from under Kaedric's world. Marcus, the one person who'd remained loyal until Kaedric released him, who'd tried to save him from self-destruction, who'd walked away only because Kaedric had demanded it, now marked for death because Pemberton feared loose ends. You're certain? I heard the entire conversation. My father, Lord Westfield, Lady Isolde. They were in the study after dinner discussing logistics. Catherine's voice cracked. Catherine's paw. They talked about it like they were planning a hunt. Casual, efficient, just another problem to be solved. Westfield, Isolde, Pemberton. The coalition was tighter than he'd realized, more coordinated, more ruthless. And Isolde had brought Westfield fully into the conspiracy, turned him from naive romantic into active participant. Faster than Kaedric anticipated. His campaign of whispered doubts hadn't worked. She'd already secured Westfield's loyalty through methods Kaedric recognized because he'd watched her deploy them before. Sex, vulnerability, the appearance of needing protection, the same weapon she'd used on him. You need to warn them, Catherine said. Tonight, before Pemberton's men move. Kaedric returned to the documents, spread them across the table, evidence of conspiracy, murder, systematic corruption, everything he needed to destroy Pemberton legally. But legal destruction took time. Investigations, trials, parliamentary hearings. Marcus would be dead before any of that mattered. He had a choice. Use the evidence to save himself through official channels, or use it to wage war immediately and save the one person who didn't deserve to die for Kaedric's failures. The decision wasn't difficult. Kaedric began photographing the documents with systematic efficiency. Every page, every letter, every piece of evidence preserved in duplicate. Insurance against the originals being destroyed. Catherine watched silently. When he finished, he handed her the satchel. Hide this somewhere your father can't find it, not at Pemberton House. Somewhere secure. What are you going to do? What I should have done 6 months ago. He moved toward the door. Stop playing by their rules. Kaedric, he turned back. If this is a trap, if you're working with your father, if I find Marcus dead tomorrow because you led me into an ambush. His voice remained quiet, absolutely cold. I will make you regret surviving childhood. Catherine didn't flinch. It's not a trap. I swear on everything I have left. He studied her face, searching for deception, for the micro-expressions that betrayed lies, found only desperate sincerity. Good enough. He left Ashford Hall at a dead run. The carriage he'd borrowed from a former associate who still owed him favors carried him toward London at dangerous speed. The driver knew better than to ask questions, just drove while Kaedric loaded the pistol he'd carried to the Rose and Thorn and checked the knives concealed in his clothing. Marcus lived in a townhouse in Bloomsbury. Respectable neighborhood, quiet streets. The kind of place where violence was rare enough that no one maintained serious security. Perfect target for professionals. Kaedric arrived just after 4 in the morning. The streets were empty. Fog pooled between buildings. Gaslight created more shadows than illumination. He dismissed the carriage 3 blocks away. Approached on foot, watching, listening, searching for the signs of ambush Catherine had warned about. The townhouse looked quiet, too quiet. No lights in the windows, no movement behind curtains. The kind of stillness that happened either when residents were asleep or when professionals had already struck. Kaedric circled the building, found the service entrance unlocked. Not broken, just open. Left that way deliberately for someone's escape. He entered with the pistol drawn. The interior was dark, silent. His eyes adjusted slowly, shapes resolving from shadows, furniture, doorways, the ordinary architecture of domestic life. Nothing moved. He made his way to the stairs, climbed with careful silence toward the second floor where Marcus maintained his private chambers. The door stood open. Kedrick's grip tightened on the pistol. He stepped through the doorway ready for violence. Found it, but not the kind he expected. Marcus sat at his desk by the window, fully dressed, awake, a glass of brandy on the leather surface beside neat stacks of documents. He turned when Kedrick entered, no surprise on his face, just resignation. "I wondered when you'd come," Marcus said quietly. Something was wrong. Everything was wrong. The air felt thick, wrong. Like walking into a room where oxygen had been replaced with something toxic. Kedrick kept the pistol raised. "Catherine Pemberton came to Ashford Hall tonight. She warned me about an attack planned for tomorrow. Said you were a target." "Catherine." Marcus smiled without humor. "Yes. She would do that. She has a conscience, unlike the rest of us." "What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that you're standing in my home at 4 a.m. holding a gun because a young girl gave you exactly the information we wanted you to have." Marcus stood slowly, hands visible, no weapons. "I'm talking about the trap you walked into the moment you decided to trust someone simply because she seemed desperate." The floor disappeared, reality inverted. Kedrick's mind processed the implications in fragments, pieces snapping together into a picture he didn't want to see. "You're working with Pemberton." "I've been working with Pemberton since before your fall began. Who do you think provided the inside information that made destroying you possible?" Marcus moved toward the window, casual, unafraid. "Lady Isolde was brilliant, but she didn't have access to your legal documentation, your financial structures, the evidence needed to build an ironclad case. You gave them everything." "I gave them what they needed to dismantle a man who'd become too dangerous, too powerful, too willing to burn the world rather than accept any limitation on his ambition." Marcus turned from the window. "You terrified people, Kedrick, not just enemies, allies, friends, everyone who got close enough to see what you really were underneath the polish." "So you betrayed me, Mum. So I protected society from you." No apology in his voice, just flat certainty. "You were building towards something catastrophic. I saw the signs, the increasing paranoia, the willingness to destroy anyone who questioned you, the absolute conviction that you were untouchable." Marcus gestured at the documents on his desk. "Someone had to stop you before you damaged more than just yourself." Kedrick's hand remained steady on the pistol despite the world fracturing around him. "Catherine's evidence, the documents proving Pemberton's conspiracy. Carefully curated forgeries mixed with genuine correspondence, designed to be convincing enough that you'd trust them, that you'd act on them." Marcus sat back down at his desk. "You were supposed to go to Parliament, present the evidence, make yourself vulnerable to arrest for possession of stolen documents and conspiracy to blackmail government officials. But I didn't. No. You came here instead, to save me, to play the hero one last time before the final curtain." Marcus poured another measure of brandy. "That's always been your weakness, Kedrick. Underneath all the ruthlessness, all the strategic brilliance, all the calculated cruelty, there's still a part of you that wants to be the man your father raised. Noble, protective, good. That man died months ago." "Did he? Then why are you standing in my home trying to save my life instead of using those documents to save yourself?" The question hit harder than any physical blow, because Marcus was right. Kedrick had chosen Marcus over self-preservation, had prioritized warning someone who'd already abandoned him over using evidence that could restore everything. The old weakness, the human weakness, the part of him that still believed loyalty meant something, even after everyone he'd trusted had proven it meant nothing. "What happens now?" Kedrick asked quietly. "Now you have two choices. Put down the gun and accept arrest. Pemberton's men are already surrounding the building. You'll face trial for breaking and entering, attempted murder, conspiracy. Everything we need to ensure you disappear into prison permanently. Or you try to fight your way out, kill me, kill whoever else you encounter, prove to everyone that you're exactly the monster we claimed you were." Marcus lifted his glass in mock toast. "Either way, you lose. The only question is whether you lose with some dignity remaining or whether you burn away the last shred of humanity, keeping you from becoming the thing you fear most. Kedrick stood in Marcus's study holding a pistol aimed at a man who'd betrayed him more thoroughly than Isolde ever could. Because Isolde was a predator, expected behavior from expected sources. But Marcus had been different, had been the voice of reason, the anchor to something resembling morality, the reminder that power needed limits, and all of it had been performance, strategy. Another weapon aimed at making sure Kedrick destroyed himself. Outside, he heard footsteps. Multiple sets. Professional. Coordinated. The sound of men taking positions around a building where their target was trapped. Marcus had been right about everything. The evidence was bait. Catherine was a weapon. The entire scenario had been designed to force Kedrick into making the choice that would confirm every accusation they'd made. Fight and prove he was a monster. Surrender and disappear forever. The trap was perfect. Beautifully designed. Exactly the kind of strategy Kedrick would have built himself if the roles were reversed. He lowered the pistol. Marcus's expression flickered. Surprise. He'd expected violence, had prepared for it. The peaceful surrender clearly disrupted his calculations. Smart choice, Marcus said carefully. No. Just the only choice that doesn't give you what you want. Kedrick set the pistol on the desk. You designed this to break me, to force me to reveal the monster underneath. But that monster doesn't exist. Never did? You created him through 18 months of systematic manipulation and betrayal. That's not... I was ruthless, possessive, controlling, everything you claimed. But I was never what you made me into after the fall. He moved toward the door. The man capable of murder died somewhere between Isolde's final letter and tonight. What's left isn't a monster, it's just hollow. He opened the door, stepped into the hallway, found 6 armed men waiting. Pemberton stood at the back of the group, satisfied, triumphant, the expression of someone watching their plan execute flawlessly. Behind him was Isolde, and beside her, Lord Westfield. The entire coalition assembled to witness Kedrick's final surrender. Mr. Thorne, Pemberton said formally, you're under arrest for attempted murder, breaking and entering, and conspiracy to commit violence against Crown officials. Kedrick looked past him to Isolde. Her face remained neutral, controlled, but he saw something flicker in her eyes when their gazes met. Not victory, uncertainty. She'd expected the monster too, expected him to rage, to fight, to prove that everything she'd done was justified by the violence he was capable of. Instead, she got a hollow man surrendering without resistance. The moment stretched. Fragile. Pregnant with the kind of tension that preceded either violence or collapse. Kedrick made his choice. Not for them, for himself. For the last piece of humanity they hadn't managed to corrupt. He raised his hand slowly. I surrender. The words tasted like poison, like defeat, like the death of everything he'd ever been. But underneath the bitterness was something else. Relief. The war was over. He'd lost. And losing meant he could finally stop fighting. The guards moved forward, professional, efficient. They bound his hands with practiced ease, led him toward the stairs where a police carriage waited outside. He passed close to Isolde on the way down. Their eyes met for the last time. She opened her mouth, closed it. Whatever she'd planned to say died unuttered. Good. There were no words left between them anyway. Just the vast distance between the person he'd thought she was and the predator she'd always been. Outside, dawn was beginning to break over London, gray light filtering through fog. The city waking to another day of commerce and betrayal, and people destroying each other in the name of survival. They loaded him into the carriage, locked the door. Kedrick sat in darkness, listening to wheels roll over cobblestones carrying him toward whatever came next. Prison, trial, public humiliation, the complete erasure of everything he'd built. But underneath the despair was something unexpected. Curiosity about what kind of man emerged from total destruction, about whether anything remained when you stripped away power and pride and the last illusions about human nature, about whether the monster they feared existed at all, or whether he'd simply been a man who'd forgotten that humanity wasn't weakness. It was the only thing worth protecting. The carriage rolled through London's awakening streets. And Cadric Thorne disappeared into the machinery of a justice system designed by the same people who destroyed him. The final betrayal. The perfect trap. The moment when everything he'd fought to preserve shattered completely, leaving only the question of what grew in the wasteland afterward. The cell they threw him into smelled like decades of human despair compressed into stone and iron. Newgate Prison, where London sent men it wanted to forget before hanging them in front of crowds who cheered like it was theater. Kedrick sat on the wooden bench that served as furniture and felt nothing, not fear, not rage, just the peculiar emptiness that came from finally reaching bottom after months of falling. The guards had stripped him of everything: coat, weapons, the photographs he'd taken of Catherine's documents, even the small silver watch his father had given him before dying. All of it catalogued, stored, evidence for a trial that would be spectacle rather than justice. He'd been processed like livestock, measured, recorded, assigned a number that replaced his name. Former Duke reduced to prisoner 47. The irony would have been amusing if he'd retained the capacity for amusement. 3 days passed in gray sameness. Food appeared twice daily: thin gruel, hard bread, water that tasted like rust. Guards came and went on schedules designed to prevent familiarity. No conversation, no information, just the mechanical maintenance of bodies waiting for judicial disposal. On the 4th day, the cell door opened outside normal hours. A guard entered, different from the usual rotation, older, scarred face suggesting violence was familiar territory. He carried no food, no water, just a folded piece of paper he handed to Cadric without speaking, then left. Cadric unfolded the paper slowly. Written in careful script, "The trial is set for 3 days from now. Pemberton has ensured the verdict. You'll hang within the week. But there's another option. Someone wants to speak with you first. Tonight, midnight. The guard will return. If you want to live, come quietly. No signature, no indication of who'd sent it." Cadric read it 3 times, analyzing, searching for the angle. The trap within the trap. Another layer of manipulation designed to extract something they hadn't already taken. He had nothing left to extract, which meant whoever sent this wanted something else. Information, probably. Or public confession. Some final piece of theater to cement his guilt before the execution. He should refuse, should accept the hanging with whatever dignity remained, should deny them the satisfaction of watching him grasp at false hope like a drowning man reaching for debris. But curiosity was a stubborn thing, even in men who'd stopped caring about survival. At midnight, the scarred guard returned, unlocked the cell without speaking, gestured for Cadric to follow. They moved through corridors he hadn't seen during intake, deeper into the prison, away from cells holding common criminals, toward the administrative section where wardens and officials conducted business. The guard stopped before a heavy wooden door, knocked twice. A voice from inside, "Enter." The guard opened the door, stepped aside. Cadric walked into a room that looked more like a gentleman's study than prison office. Books on shelves, paintings on walls, on a desk made from mahogany that probably cost more than most prisoners would earn in lifetimes. Behind the desk sat Lord Chancellor Beaumont, the same man who'd offered him employment in exchange for restored titles, who'd warned about conspiracies, who'd represented Crown authority during the coordinated destruction of everything Cadric had built. Beaumont gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." Cadric remained standing. "If you're here to offer deals, I'm not interested." "Besichpan." "Not deals. Truth." Beaumont leaned back in his chair. "You've been convicted before trial, sentenced before testimony. The entire proceeding is choreographed. Pemberton owns the judges. Isolde has provided testimony that paints you as violent and unstable. Marcus has documented your crimes in excruciating detail. You're scheduled to hang in 5 days. I know? Do you know why? Because I became inconvenient, because powerful people wanted my resources, because I made enemies and they finally coordinated effectively. Pick your reason. They're all true. Those are symptoms, not cause." Beaumont stood, moved to the window overlooking the prison yard where executions happened at dawn. "You're being eliminated because you discovered something that threatened not just Pemberton or Isolde, something that threatened the entire structure holding this country together." Cadric's analytical mind engaged despite his exhaustion. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, your investigation into Pemberton's finances. The photographs you took from his study during the ball. You documented connections to a French banking consortium. Beaumont turned from the window. That consortium is funding a network of conspirators planning to destabilize the crown. Multiple noble families, government officials, military officers, all working in coordination to create a crisis that would allow them to seize power. The conspiracy you wanted me to infiltrate. Yes, except you got closer than we anticipated. You identified key players, documented financial relationships, started mapping the infrastructure. Beaumont returned to his desk. And then Pemberton realized what you'd discovered. So he activated plans that had been years in development, destroyed you before you could act on what you'd learned. Why tell me this now? Because the conspiracy is accelerating. They're planning to move within weeks, and we've lost our best asset for stopping them. Beaumont's expression remained neutral, professional. You were supposed to infiltrate their network, gather evidence, help us dismantle the operation from inside. Instead, they neutralized you, and we're running out of time. Kedrick laughed. Hollow, empty. So this is recruitment. You want me to fight your war after you stood by and watched them destroy me. I want you to fight for England, the country you've exploited for profit, certainly, but also the country that gave you everything you had before you lost it. Beaumont pulled a document from his desk drawer. I can offer commutation, not pardon. You'd still be guilty, still stripped of titles, but alive, free, able to operate, in exchange for becoming your weapon. In exchange for stopping people who will turn this country into a battlefield, who will sacrifice thousands for their ambition, who make your ruthlessness look like gentleness by comparison. The offer hung between them. Life for servitude, freedom for obligation. Another trap wrapped in opportunity. Kedrick studied Beaumont's face, searching for deception, for the angle that would reveal this as more manipulation, more theater designed to extract something valuable before disposal. He found only exhausted sincerity. The Lord Chancellor looked older than he had at Ashford Hall, worn down by pressures Kedrick couldn't see, fighting battles that happened in shadows where the public never looked. What happened to me was necessary, Beaumont said quietly. Pemberton had to believe we'd fully abandoned you, had to believe you were completely isolated. Otherwise, he'd never have revealed the full scope of his network. Your destruction was the price of learning who our enemies really are. You sacrificed me as bait, and we sacrificed a ruthless duke to identify traitors to the crown. Yes. No apology, just acknowledgement of brutal calculus. Now we're offering you a chance to make that sacrifice mean something, to become the weapon we always needed, unencumbered by titles, by reputation, by anything except the mission. Kedrick moved to the window, looked down at the execution yard where they'd kill him in 5 days if he refused. The scaffold was already built, permanent fixture, used weekly for men whose crimes ranged from murder to stealing bread. Society's solution to inconvenient people, final and absolute. He thought about Marcus, about Isolde, about Pemberton and the coalition that had destroyed him so thoroughly. They believed they'd won, believed they'd eliminated the threat he represented. They were wrong, not because he was dangerous, but because they'd created something more dangerous by stripping away everything that made him hesitate. Titles brought obligation. Reputation demanded restraint. Fear of loss created caution. He had none of those limitations anymore. They'd accidentally freed the one version of himself that understood violence as solution rather than last resort. The version that existed before society taught him to mask predatory instinct behind civilized behavior. The man his father had tried to destroy through education and moral instruction. The thing underneath that had been waiting decades to resurface. If I do this, Kedrick said slowly, I do it my way. No oversight, no restrictions, no rules about methods or collateral damage. Agreed. I'll need resources, money, access, information. You'll have everything. And when it's over, when your conspiracy is eliminated and your crown is secure, I disappear permanently. No more recruitment. No more missions. Just exile and silence. Beaumont nodded. Agreed. Help us stop them and you'll have your freedom. What's left of it? Kedrick turned from the window. One more condition. Name it. When this is finished, when the conspirators are dead or imprisoned, Isolde faces consequences. His voice remained flat, empty of emotion. Not from me. I'll never touch her. But she doesn't get to walk away clean. She participated in treason. She facilitated conspiracy. She gets prosecuted alongside everyone else. Beaumont studied him for a long moment. You still care about her? No. I care about making certain predators face the natural consequences of predation. She taught me that weakness is vulnerability, that trust is weapon, that mercy is mistake. Kedrick smiled without warmth. Time she learned those lessons herself. Done. They sealed the agreement without handshakes or signatures. Just two men acknowledging mutual need in a prison office while London slept unaware that its fate was being negotiated in darkness. Beaumont handed him a sealed envelope. Everything you need is inside: safe houses, contacts, financial access. The names of conspirators we've identified and the ones we suspect start with Pemberton. He's the infrastructure holding the network together. How do you want me to proceed? Dismantle them, however you see fit. We'll provide support, but we won't interfere with methods. Beaumont's expression hardened. These people are planning to burn England for power. Stop them. I don't care how much blood it costs. Kedrick took the envelope. What about the trial, the execution? There won't be one. You escaped tonight during transfer to another facility. Killed 2 guards in the process. There's a manhunt, but you vanished. Beaumont gestured to the door. As of this moment, you're a ghost, dead to society, free to operate without limitation. How long do I have? 3 weeks? Maybe 4? Then they move and everything collapses. Beaumont returned to his desk, suddenly looked exhausted, decades older than his years. Stop them, Kedrick, or we lose everything. The scarred guard led him out through passages that circumvented normal security. They emerged in an alley behind the prison where a carriage waited, plain, unremarkable. Driver wearing clothes that suggested working class rather than government service. Kedrick climbed inside. The door closed. The carriage pulled away from Newgate Prison, carrying a man who'd just been erased from official existence. No longer Duke, no longer prisoner. Just operative aimed at targets who didn't know they'd already lost. He opened Beaumont's envelope. Inside were documents, photographs, bank statements, chatted. Everything the Crown had compiled on Pemberton's conspiracy. Names he recognized, names he didn't. Connections mapped out with military precision. And at the center of the web, Lord Pemberton, Lady Isolde, and Lord Westfield. The triumvirate that destroyed him, now revealed as traitors planning to overthrow the government they pretended to serve. Kedrick studied the evidence with cold satisfaction. They'd made one critical mistake. They'd assumed destroying him meant he stopped being dangerous, that removing his power removed his capacity for violence, that breaking his empire broke his understanding of how empires fell. He spent the next 2 weeks becoming invisible, growing a beard that changed his profile, wearing clothes that erased his former status, moving through London like smoke through architecture, untraceable, unremarkable. Just another forgettable man in a city of millions who'd learned to ignore anyone not immediately threatening. He used Beaumont's resources to establish safe houses, communication networks, supply chains for information and equipment, built the infrastructure for a campaign that would operate below the surface of normal society. Meanwhile, he watched, followed, documented, learned. Pemberton maintained 3 primary residences: the London townhouse, the country estate in Hampshire, and a private club where the conspiracy met under guise of social gathering. Isolde had moved into Westfield's residence, playing devoted fiancée while coordinating with Pemberton and other conspirators. She'd transformed Westfield completely, turned him from naive romantic into active participant in treason. Impressive work. She really was extraordinarily talented at corruption. Marcus maintained his legal practice while serving as the conspiracy's documentation specialist, ensuring everything remained technically legal until the moment they activated their coup. The network was sophisticated, well-funded, paranoid about security, but not paranoid enough, because they believed Kedrick was either dead or imprisoned, eliminated, no longer a factor in calculations. That assumption would kill them. Kedrick chose the private club as his entry point, not because it was vulnerable, because it was the node where all 3 primary targets intersected regularly. Strike there and he'd wound the entire network simultaneously. He spent 3 days mapping the building, servant entrances, guard rotations, sight lines, escape routes, the complete architecture of a target that believed its exclusivity provided security. On the night of the 18th day since his recruitment, he moved. The club sat in Mayfair. Elegant, expensive, protected by members who believed wealth and status created immunity from consequence. Guards at the entrance screened visitors. Cameras would record anything suspicious. The entire building designed to prevent exactly what Kedrick planned. He entered through the kitchen, same strategy as Pemberton's ball. Servants were invisible, their passages unmonitored. The assumption that working-class people lacked agency to threaten aristocratic safety. Fatal weakness. He wore kitchen staff uniform, carried supplies that justified presence, moved with the confidence of someone who belonged. Nobody questioned him. Nobody looked closely. Just another body servicing the needs of people who never noticed the machinery keeping luxury functional. Kedrick navigated to the second floor where private meeting rooms hosted gatherings that required discretion. He'd learned through surveillance that Pemberton had reserved the East Room tonight. Expected attendees included key conspirators finalizing plans for their move against the crown, including Isolde and Westfield. The corridor outside the room was empty, too early for the meeting. Kedrick entered the room next door, a smaller space, currently unused, shared a wall with the target room. He positioned himself against that wall, ear pressed to expensive wallpaper covering lath and plaster. Old building, beautiful but poorly insulated for sound, perfect for eavesdropping. Voices filtered through as attendees arrived. Pemberton first, his pompous tone unmistakable, issuing orders to someone about refreshments. Then Westfield, younger voice, excited, nervous, the energy of someone participating in something they barely understood but found thrilling. Then her, Isolde's voice cut through the wall like ice through flesh. Calm, controlled. The same tone she'd used while lying beside him in Ashford Hall, while extracting information, while planning his destruction. Kedrick's hands tightened into fists despite his intention to remain detached. Some wounds stayed fresh regardless of time. More voices joined. Lords and ladies whose names appeared on Beaumont's list. Military officers, government officials. At least 15 people gathering in that room to finalize treason. The meeting began. Pemberton spoke first. Outlining timeline. 3 weeks until activation. Coordinated attacks on key government buildings. Manufactured crisis to justify emergency measures. Then seizure of power under pretense of stabilization. Classic coup architecture, boring in its predictability. Someone asked about potential resistance. Loyalist forces. Crown response. Pemberton dismissed the concern. They'd neutralized key opponents, bribed others, isolated anyone dangerous. The Duke of Ashford had been the last significant threat, and he was dead or imprisoned, no longer relevant. Laughter rippled through the room. They were celebrating his elimination. Kedrick listened to them mock his fall, joke about his desperation, share stories about how thoroughly they'd dismantled everything he built. He felt nothing, not rage, not shame, not even satisfaction that they'd underestimated him so completely, just cold calculation about which of them would die first. Isolde's voice cut through the casual cruelty. Business, focus. They needed to finalize communication protocols, ensure everyone understood their roles, coordinate timing down to the hour. Professional as always, Kedrick had taught her that. How to manage complex operations, how to maintain control during chaos, how to lead through absolute certainty even when circumstances were uncertain. She'd learned well. Too well. The meeting continued for 90 minutes. Every detail of the conspiracy laid bare. Evidence that would convict all of them. Testimony delivered in their own voices. Kedrick photographed nothing, recorded nothing. He didn't need documentation. Beaumont already had enough evidence for prosecution. This wasn't about justice. This was about making them understand what they'd created when they destroyed a man who'd spent decades learning how to destroy things. The meeting ended. Attendees dispersed, voices fading as they left the room. Within minutes, silence returned. Kedrick waited, made certain everyone had truly gone, then moved. He entered the corridor, descended to the ground floor, exited through the same kitchen entrance he'd used to arrive. Outside, London's night air tasted like coal smoke and future violence. He had 3 weeks. 3 weeks to dismantle a conspiracy that had taken years to build. 3 weeks to prove that the most dangerous man isn't the one with everything to lose. It's the one with nothing left to protect. Kedrick walked into darkness knowing exactly what came next. Not justice, not redemption. Just the cold, methodical elimination of everyone who'd mistaken his humanity for weakness. Starting tomorrow. Starting with the foundations holding their conspiracy together. Starting with making them understand that dead men made the most terrifying opponents. Because they'd already lost everything fear was designed to protect. The war they'd started was about to become the apocalypse they never anticipated. And Kedrick Thorne was finally, perfectly, completely free to become the monster they'd always feared existed beneath the surface. The first target fell on the third night after the club meeting. Not Pemberton. Not Isolde. Not any of the primary conspirators who expected retaliation. Lord Ashworth. Minor player. Financial coordinator who managed money flowing between the conspiracy and their French backers. He lived in a modest townhouse in Kensington with minimal security and the comfortable arrogance of men who believed their insignificance protected them from attention. Kedrick entered through an unlocked study window at 2 a.m, found Ashworth asleep in his chambers, woke him by placing a knife against his throat with enough pressure to draw a single drop of blood. Ashworth's eyes snapped open. Terror, immediate and absolute. Kedrick pressed a finger to his own lips. Silence. Then he handed Ashworth a sealed envelope and withdrew the blade. Inside the envelope was a detailed accounting of every treasonous transaction Ashworth had facilitated. Dates, amounts, recipient names. Everything documented with the precision of someone who understood how financial crimes were prosecuted. Beneath the accounting was a single sentence written in Kedrick's hand. "Turn yourself into Crown authorities by dawn, or I return to finish what I started." Ashworth stared at the documents with shaking hands. Kedrick left the same way he'd entered. By morning, Ashworth had surrendered to government officials, confessed everything, provided testimony implicating others in exchange for reduced charges. The conspiracy's financial infrastructure began fracturing immediately. 2 nights later, Kedrick visited Colonel Hartwick, military officer coordinating armed forces that would support the coup. He received a similar envelope containing evidence of his treason and the same ultimatum. Hartwick also surrendered by dawn. The pattern repeated across London. One conspirator after another receiving midnight visits from a ghost they'd believed was dead or imprisoned. Each one given the same choice: confess or die. Most chose confession. The ones who didn't disappeared in ways that looked like accidents but carried the unmistakable signature of professional elimination. Pemberton noticed the collapse after the 5th defection. Emergency meeting, the same private club. Smaller group this time. Only core conspirators who hadn't yet been compromised. Kedrick listened from his position in the adjacent room while they argued about response strategy. Pemberton wanted to accelerate the timeline, move immediately before more defections destroyed their capability. Isolde argued for caution. Someone was systematically dismantling their network. They needed to identify the threat before proceeding. Westfield suggested it might be Crown intelligence, that Beaumont had discovered their plans. They were all wrong. This wasn't Crown intelligence. This was something older, more personal. The kind of violence that happened when you stripped away civilization and found the predator underneath still remembered how to hunt. The meeting dissolved without consensus. Fear was fracturing their coordination, making them paranoid, turning allies into potential threats. Exactly what Kedrick intended. He didn't need to destroy them directly, just needed to make them destroy themselves through suspicion and panic. The same strategy they'd used on him, turned back on its architects with interest. Poetic, in a way that would have amused him if he still experienced amusement. 3 more conspirators surrendered over the next week. 2 others died in accidents that weren't accidents. The network was collapsing faster than Pemberton could contain. Finally, inevitably, they realized the truth. Kedrick learned about their revelation through a servant he'd bribed to report on Pemberton's household. The Lord had received information from contacts in Newgate Prison. The Duke of Ashford had escaped weeks ago, killed guards during the breakout, vanished into London. He was alive. He was hunting them. And he'd been systematically destroying their conspiracy while they celebrated his elimination. The servant reported that Pemberton smashed furniture when he learned. Isolde had gone pale. Westfield had demanded explanations for how a dead man was terrorizing them. Good. Fear was the first step toward capitulation. Kedrick waited 2 more days. Let the paranoia ferment. Let them exhaust themselves searching for a ghost who'd learned to move through their world invisible and untouchable. Then he sent a message. Not to Pemberton, not to Isolde, to Catherine. Simple note delivered through the same courier network he'd established. Meet me where this started. Tomorrow night, come alone. She arrived at the private club precisely at midnight, cautious, scanning shadows for threats. She'd learned wariness during the week since betraying her father's conspiracy. Kedrick stepped from darkness near the servants' entrance. Catherine startled, hand moving toward something concealed in her coat. Weapon, probably. Smart girl. She'd prepared for betrayal. He raised his hand slowly, non-threatening. I'm not here to hurt you. Then why am I here? Because you gave me information that saved my life, even if it was bait for a trap. He moved closer but maintained distance, respected her boundaries. And because I want you to understand what happens next before it happens. Catherine's expression hardened. You're going to kill my father. No, I'm going to offer him the same choice I offered everyone else. Surrender or die. But he won't surrender. His pride won't allow it. So yes, eventually. Your father will die because of decisions he made long before tonight. And you want my blessing. I want you to know that when it happens, you're not responsible. Your father built this, orchestrated treason, chose ambition over everything including your safety. Kedrick's voice remained flat, empty of judgment, just stating facts. You tried to escape by giving me information. That was survival, not betrayal. The betrayal belongs to him. Catherine looked away, toward the club where her father had planned the destruction of England inside rooms designed for luxury. When she spoke again, her voice cracked slightly. He sold me like livestock, arranged my marriage to a monster because it served his political ambitions. I was property to him, always was. Just took me 18 years to admit it. I know. Do you actually understand what it feels like to realize the person who should have protected you saw you as resource to be exploited? Kedrick thought about Isolde, about Marcus, about every person who'd gained his trust and used it as weapon. Yes, I understand exactly what that feels like. They stood in silence for a moment, two people who'd learned the same brutal lesson about human nature from different teachers. Finally, Catherine asked, "What happens to me after?" You disappear. I've arranged passage to America, new identity. Enough money to start over somewhere your father's name means nothing. He handed her an envelope. Everything you need is inside. Ship leaves in 3 days. Be on it. Why would you help me? Because you helped me when you didn't have to. Because you're 18 and shouldn't spend your life paying for your father's crimes. Because I remember what it felt like to believe people might occasionally do decent things without ulterior motive. He stepped back toward the shadows. Go. Start over. Become someone better than the people who made you. Catherine took the envelope with trembling hands. What about you? What do you become after this? Nothing. That's the point, but... She left without another word. Kedrick watched her disappear into London's night and felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, not pride, just the faint ghost of what might have been humanity before everything else burned away. The endgame began 48 hours later. Pemberton's country estate in Hampshire. Remote, heavily guarded. The place where core conspirators had retreated after London became too dangerous. They'd fortified it, hired professional security, transformed a gentleman's country house into a defensive position. Kedrick studied it from the tree line for 2 nights, mapping patrol patterns, identifying weaknesses, planning insertion routes that minimized violence against guards, who were just hired men doing jobs. He'd become comfortable with killing, but he preferred precision over massacre. Professional standards mattered even in warfare. On the 3rd night, he moved. The estate sat on 200 acres of manicured grounds. Beautiful even in darkness. The kind of wealth that happened when exploitation was inherited across generations. Gardens, fountains, architecture designed to communicate power through aesthetic dominance. All of it about to become a battlefield. Kedrick bypassed the main gates, entered through the deer park on the eastern boundary where fencing was decorative rather than functional, moved through shadows like something that had never been entirely human. just patient, methodical, inevitable. 2 guards patrolled the rear gardens. He avoided them. Not worth the noise. Service entrance. Unlocked. Same pattern as every infiltration. Servants were architecture's greatest vulnerability, had been for centuries. Would be forever because the wealthy couldn't imagine that the invisible people maintaining their comfort might be vectors for violence. Inside, the estate was quiet. After midnight, most residents asleep. Guards stationed at key positions, but not patrolling interior spaces. They expected external threats, not ghosts already inside their walls. Kedrick made his way to the second floor where Pemberton maintained his private chambers. The hallway was carpeted, sound dampening, perfect conditions for approach. He stopped outside Pemberton's door, listened. Voices inside, multiple people, meeting despite the late hour. Probably couldn't sleep. Probably felt the net closing around them. Probably knew that everything was ending but couldn't accept how or when. Kedrick opened the door without knocking. The room contained exactly who he expected. Lord Pemberton stood by the fireplace. Fat. Sweating despite the cool night. He'd aged dramatically in 3 weeks. Fear was corrosive that way. Lady Isolde sat in a high-backed chair, still beautiful, still composed. But something haunted her eyes. The thing that happened when predators realized they'd misjudged their prey. Lord Westfield paced near the window. Younger, less damaged, but starting to show cracks in his certainty. Probably realizing too late that the woman he loved had led him into something he didn't understand. They all turned when Kedrick entered. 3 different reactions. Pemberton reached for the pistol on the mantel. Hands shaking, survival instinct overwhelming tactical sense. Isolde went absolutely still. Every muscle locked. The freeze response of someone who'd seen this predator before. Who knew exactly what he was capable of when limitations were removed. Westfield just stared. Confusion. Disbelief. The expression of men learning that reality was significantly more complicated than their sheltered experience suggested. Kedrick closed the door behind him. Calm. Unhurried. Death wore no schedule. Sit down, Pemberton. If you touch that gun, I'll kill you before your fingers reach the grip. Pemberton's hand froze halfway to the weapon. Trembling. He tried to speak, failed, tried again. You're supposed to be dead. I'm supposed to be many things. Dead, imprisoned, broken, but suppositions don't survive contact with reality. Kedrick moved deeper into the room. Kedrick moved deeper into the positioning himself where he could watch all 3 simultaneously. Your conspiracy is over. 14 of your network have surrendered to Crown authorities. 8 more are dead. The ones remaining are too terrified to act. You lost. You can't prove anything. Pemberton's voice cracked. We were careful, covered our tracks. Everything was... I don't need to prove anything. Lord Chancellor Beaumont has enough evidence to hang you 10 times over. Testimony from the people who surrendered. Documents. Recordings. Everything required for treason prosecution. Kedrick's gaze shifted to Isolde, including testimony about who provided the intelligence that made destroying me possible. Isolde's face remained neutral, but her hands tightened on the chair arms. White knuckles. The only tell that she understood exactly how thoroughly her performance had collapsed. Westfield finally found his voice. What do you want? I want you to understand what you participated in, what she made you complicit in. Kedrick gestured toward Isolde. You think you're in love, that she's the victim who needed rescue, that I was the monster she escaped from. But you're just the next target, the next mark, the next man she's manipulating into giving her access to resources and power. That's not true. Westfield moved toward Isolde. Protective. Defensive. She loves me. We're building a life together. She loved me too. Said so every night while extracting information that would destroy me, while coordinating with Pemberton, while planning my systematic elimination. Kedrick's voice remained absolutely flat. You're not special, Westfield. You're convenient. And when you stop being convenient, she'll destroy you the same way she destroyed me. Don't listen to him. Isolde stood, finally speaking. Her voice carried that same honey-smooth quality Kedrick remembered from Ashford Hall. He's trying to fracture us. To make you doubt, that's what he does. Manipulates, controls, destroys anything he can't possess. You're right, Kedrick said. I did those things. Was possessive, controlling, treated you like property rather than person. All accurate, all true, all reasons you had justification for leaving. He took a step closer. But leaving isn't what you did. You didn't flee, didn't seek safety. You orchestrated my complete destruction while pretending to care. That's not escape. That's warfare. And in war, combatants face consequences. Us. Pemberton seized the moment of distraction, grabbed the pistol from the mantel, turned, aimed with shaking hands. Don't move or I'll shoot! Kedrick didn't move, just looked at Pemberton with the empty expression of someone who'd stopped fearing death months ago. Shoot then. Add murder to your treason charges. Watch how quickly your remaining allies abandon you when you become a common killer instead of a political conspirator. His voice carried no fear, no tension, just certainty. Or put the gun down and face justice with whatever dignity you have left. Pemberton's hands shook harder, sweat dripped down his face. His finger tightened on the trigger. For a moment, the room balanced on the edge of violence. Then Isolde spoke. Quiet. Controlled. The voice she used when managing situations that required precision. Put it down, he's right. Shooting him solves nothing. But he's... Put it down, Pemberton. The Lord lowered the pistol slowly, defeated, broken. The thing that happened when architects of conspiracies realized their designs had collapsed. Kedrick moved to the fireplace, took the weapon, removed the ammunition, set both on the mantel out of reach, then turned back to face the three people who'd destroyed his life, while congratulating themselves on their strategic brilliance. Here's what happens next. Tomorrow morning, Crown forces arrive to arrest everyone in this house. You'll be charged with high treason, conspiracy, attempted coup. The evidence is overwhelming. The trials will be brief. The sentence is final. He looked at each of them in turn. Pemberton, you'll hang. Your title will be stripped. Your family disgraced. Everything you built dissolved. Westfield, you'll face prison. Probably 20 years. By the time you're released, you'll be middle-aged and forgotten. The shipping empire your family built will belong to someone else. Your name will be footnote in history about failed conspiracies. His gaze settled on Isolde last. Held there. Two predators acknowledging each other across the wreckage of what they'd been. And you. You'll be prosecuted alongside them. Everything you did documented. Every manipulation exposed. Society will remember you exactly as you are. Not a victim, not a survivor. A conspirator who weaponized intimacy to destroy men from the inside out. Isolde held his gaze without flinching, some of the old steel returning. The thing underneath her performances that had made her so dangerous. You win then. Congratulations. No, nobody wins. That's what you never understood. This wasn't a game with victory conditions. It was mutual destruction disguised as strategy. You burned my life, I burned your conspiracy. We're both hollow now. Empty. Just ghosts haunting ruins we created together. Silence filled the room, heavy, suffocating. The weight of everything that could have been different if any of them had chosen differently at critical moments. Finally, Westfield spoke, voice small, broken. The sound of someone's world collapsing in real time. She really doesn't love me, does she? Not a question. Statement. The worst kind of truth finally acknowledged. Kedrick looked at the younger man, saw himself years ago, before Isolde, before the paranoia and possession and slow transformation into something that prioritized control over humanity. No, she doesn't. She never did. She saw opportunity. Just like she saw opportunity in me. We were both just resources to be exploited. He moved toward the door, stopped, turned back. But that doesn't mean you can't become something better than what she made you into. You're young, stupid, but not irredeemable. Prison will give you time to figure out who you actually are underneath the manipulation. Why tell me this? Because someone should have told me the same thing before I became what I became. Before I let ambition and paranoia turn me into the kind of man who treated people like chess pieces. Kedrick opened the door. Learn from this, or don't. But you have a choice about who you become after. I didn't think I did. Turns out I was wrong. He left them there, in the room where their conspiracy had finally died, where their carefully constructed lies had fractured against reality. where three people who destroyed a duke discovered that destruction was reciprocal and the bill always came due. Outside, dawn was starting to break over Hampshire, gray light filtering through morning fog. Kedrick walked across the manicured grounds toward the tree line where he'd entered. Behind him, Crown forces were arriving. Military carriages, official vehicles, the machinery of a government that had narrowly avoided catastrophe moving in to secure evidence and prisoners. Beaumont stepped out of the lead carriage, saw Kedrick, nodded once, acknowledgement, respect. The recognition between men who'd fought the same war from different positions. Kedrick returned the nod, then disappeared into the trees. He'd fulfilled his obligation, dismantled the conspiracy, prevented the coup, saved England from people who would have burned it for power. Now came the hard part, figuring out what happened to ghosts after their wars ended. 6 months later, a man who resembled the former Duke of Ashford but carried himself differently arrived in a small coastal village in Scotland. He purchased a cottage overlooking the sea with money provided by Crown accounts that officially didn't exist. The locals were told he was a retired merchant, someone who'd made his fortune and wanted quiet in his remaining years. They didn't ask many questions. Small villages understood that people who wanted isolation usually had reasons worth respecting. The man kept to himself mostly, walked the cliffs every morning, fished occasionally, read books from a small library he'd assembled. Nothing political, nothing about power or strategy or the games people played in London. Mostly philosophy, history, the kind of material that helped make sense of the wreckage life created when ambition collided with reality. He didn't sleep well. Probably never would. Too many ghosts, too many memories of the person he'd been and the things he'd done to survive becoming that person. But the dreams were getting quieter, less frequent. The rage that had sustained him through the darkest months was fading into something else. Not peace, not yet, but maybe the distant possibility of peace eventually. One morning, nearly a year after the conspiracy's collapse, he was walking the cliffs when he saw someone standing near the edge. Small figure, female, dark hair whipping in the wind. He recognized her before he got close enough to see her face. Isolde. She turned when she heard his footsteps. No surprise on her face. She'd known he was here. Must have. You didn't find someone accidentally in villages this remote. They stood 10 feet apart. The distance seemed appropriate. Safe. The kind of space that acknowledged history while preventing repetition. They released you, he said. 6 weeks ago. Reduced sentence for cooperation. Testimony against Pemberton sealed his execution. They decided I was worth more as witness than prisoner. Her voice sounded different, older, tired. Westfield got 12 years. Pemberton hanged 3 months ago. Marcus disappeared, probably fled the country before charges materialized. I know. Beaumont keeps me informed. Of course he does. Silence stretched between them, filled with everything they'd been to each other, everything they'd destroyed, everything that couldn't be recovered or rebuilt or forgiven. Finally, Isolde spoke again. Why did you let them take me alive? You could have killed all of us that night at the estate. Nobody would have questioned it. Crown would have covered it up. Well, because killing you would have made you right. Right about what? That I was the monster you described to justify what you did. That violence was my only language. That I'd become something irredeemable. He looked out at the sea crashing against rocks below. I spent 18 months becoming what you feared I was. Ruthless, possessive, willing to destroy anything that threatened my control. But underneath that, buried deep, there was still someone who remembered that mercy existed, who believed that letting the system handle justice was different than taking it personally. So you spared me to prove you weren't a monster. I spared you to prove I wasn't only a monster. There's a difference. Isolde moved closer, not intimate, just near enough to speak without shouting over the wind. Her face looked different too, harder, scarred by experiences that happened after she'd stopped being the beautiful victim everyone wanted to rescue. Do you hate me? She asked. I did. For months. Hated you more than I'd hated anything. Wanted you to suffer everything I'd suffered. Wanted you broken and hollow and destroyed. He turned to face her fully. But hate requires energy, requires caring, and I'm too tired to care anymore. So what do you feel? Nothing. That's what's left when you burn through every other emotion. Just absence where feelings used to live. She flinched, as if absence was worse than hatred, as if being nothing to him was more painful than being something he wanted destroyed. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry for what I did, how I did it. The cruelty of making you believe something that wasn't real while using your vulnerability as weapon. You're sorry you got caught. That's different than sorry for the actions." "Maybe. Probably. Don't know anymore." She wrapped her arms around herself, cold despite the spring sunshine. "I came here to tell you that I've spent the last year trying to understand why I did it. Why I couldn't just leave. Why I had to destroy you completely instead of walking away. Did you figure it out?" "Wait, mas." "I think so. I think I saw in you the same thing I've always been. Predator, user, someone who treats people as resources. And I hated seeing it reflected back because it meant I couldn't pretend to be anything else." Her voice cracked slightly. "So I destroyed you to destroy the mirror." Kedrick absorbed that, processed it, found it probably true. Definitely honest. The kind of self-awareness that came too late to matter but at least indicated growth. "What will you do now?" he asked. "I don't know. Go somewhere, start over. Try to become someone who isn't defined entirely by the worst things she's done." She looked at him with something that might have been genuine emotion. Hard to tell. She'd always been extraordinary at performance. "What about you?" "Same, but without the trying. I've accepted what I am, what I became, the good and the terrible. The human and the monster. All of it integrated instead of at war. That sounds like peace. It sounds like exhaustion disguised as wisdom. But I'll take it." They stood together on the cliff watching the sea. Two people who'd destroyed each other and somehow survived the mutual annihilation. Neither redeemed. Neither forgiven. Just existing in the aftermath of warfare that left no winners. Eventually Isolde turned to leave. Stopped. Looked back. "If you could do it over, knowing everything, would you?" Kedrick thought about Ashford Hall. About the man he'd been before her. Cold. Powerful. Successful. Alone. He thought about everything that happened after. The destruction. The rage. The months of becoming something terrible, and then fighting to remember he'd once been something else. No. I wouldn't change anything. Because all of it, the good and the catastrophic, made me into whatever this is. And this might not be good. Might not be happy. But it's real. It's mine. It's not a performant or strategic mask. Just me. Actually, me. For the first time in decades. Then maybe it was worth it. Maybe. Or maybe we're both just too broken to imagine alternatives. He smiled slightly, without warmth, but without cruelty either. "Go, start over. Become someone better than what we were together." Isolde left without another word. Kedrick watched her disappear down the coastal path. Watched the last connection to his former life walk away. Watched the person who destroyed him fade into distance until she was just another small figure against the massive landscape. He felt nothing. Not relief. Not grief. Not closure. Just the continuation of the nothing that had replaced everything else. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the strongest thing wasn't rebuilding what was lost. Maybe it was learning to exist in the emptiness afterward. Learning to breathe in spaces where the architecture of your former life used to stand. Learning to wake each morning without the weight of empire or conspiracy or love that was really warfare in disguise. Kedrick turned back toward his cottage. Small, simple, everything he needed and nothing more. The life of a man who'd learned that accumulation was just fear dressed in ambition. That power was isolation pretending to be security. That the only thing truly owned was the moment you were living and the choice about who you'd become in that moment. Behind him, the sea continued its endless assault on ancient stone. Patient, methodical. Wearing down what seemed permanent through nothing more than persistent presence. The way time eroded everything eventually. Empires, conspiracies, love, hatred, all of it ground down until only the essential remained. And what remained, after everything else was stripped away, wasn't the duke or the prisoner or the operative or the monster. Just a man. flawed, scarred, dangerous in the way of things that had survived what should have destroyed them, but also human, capable of mercy, capable of change, capable of looking at ruins and choosing to exist among them instead of trying to rebuild what couldn't be rebuilt. The cottage door closed behind him, shutting out the wind, the memories, the ghosts that would never fully disappear but had at least stopped screaming. Inside was silence, real silence. Not the oppressive quiet of power demanding obedience, just the ordinary absence of noise that happened when there was nothing left to fight and nowhere left to conquer. Kedrick sat by the window overlooking the sea and opened a book he'd been reading. Philosophy. Ancient text about accepting what couldn't be changed while maintaining agency over what could. Wisdom that had survived thousands of years because truth didn't age the way people did. He read until darkness fell, then slept without dreams for the first time in 2 years, and woke to another morning where the world continued turning despite everything that had happened. Despite empires falling, despite conspiracies failing, despite two people destroying each other so thoroughly that nothing remained except the lesson that survival was different than victory and wisdom was different than triumph. Years passed this way. Quiet, unremarkable. The kind of life that left no mark on history, but maybe left the person living it slightly more whole than they'd been before. Sometimes travelers would stop in the village, ask about the man in the cottage, on the cliffs, wonder about his story. The locals would shrug. He was retired, kept to himself, seemed content with whatever he'd made of his remaining years. Nobody mentioned the Duke of Ashford. Nobody connected the quiet man reading philosophy by the sea with the ruthless nobleman who'd once controlled half of London's wealth. That person was dead, had been dead for years, killed by betrayal and resurrection, and the long, slow process of learning that becoming something else required letting go of everything you'd been before. The man who remained wasn't better or worse, just different. Changed by fire into something that understood steel wasn't strength, and mercy wasn't weakness and the only real. Power was choosing each day who you'd become, despite everything that had tried to make you into something you weren't. On the anniversary of the conspiracy's collapse, Kedrick walked the cliffs at dawn. The same route he'd walked countless times. The same view of endless water meeting endless sky. The same reminder that the world was larger than his wounds and older than his rage, and would continue long after he was forgotten. He thought about Isolde, about Pemberton, about Marcus and Westfield and all the people who'd participated in the mutual destruction that had defined years of his life. He wondered if they'd found peace, if they'd changed, if they'd learned anything from the wreckage or just repeated the same patterns with different targets. He'd never know, had chosen not to know, because the only person he could change was himself, and that required focus that wouldn't survive if he spent it tracking the trajectories of people who'd proven they valued destruction over everything else. The sun broke over the horizon, golden light painting the water. Another day beginning, another choice about who he'd be and what he'd do with the time remaining. Kedrick turned back toward his cottage and felt something unexpected. Not happiness, not peace, not satisfaction, just the quiet recognition that he was still here, still breathing, still capable of witnessing beauty and feeling wind and choosing mercy when violence would have been easier. That was enough. Maybe it had always been enough. Maybe the empire and the titles and the power had been distractions from the simple fact that existence itself was the victory, that surviving what should have killed you was triumph, that becoming someone who could look at ruins and see possibility instead of regret was the only redemption that mattered. The cottage door opened, closed, locked out everything except the present moment, and the man he'd chosen to become after everything else burned away. And in that quiet space, that small life, that unremarkable existence, Kedrick Thorne finally found what he'd been searching for through decades of ambition and destruction and loss. Not dominance, not vindication, not victory. Just the simple truth that strength wasn't controlling everything around you. It was accepting what you couldn't control while protecting what you could. That power wasn't possession, it was presence. That love wasn't ownership. It was the willingness to be vulnerable with someone, despite knowing they could use that vulnerability to destroy you. He'd learned it all too late to save what he'd lost, but perhaps not too late to matter for whatever came after. The sea crashed against the cliffs. The wind carried salt and possibility. And somewhere in a small cottage in Scotland, a man who'd once been a duke sat by the window and smiled at nothing in particular. Because after everything, after the fall and the fury and the long climb back towards something resembling humanity, after betrayal and revenge and the hollow victory that came from watching enemies destroy themselves, after all of it, he discovered that the most terrifying thing wasn't being powerful. It was being human, vulnerable, mortal, real. And the most courageous thing wasn't conquering others, it was accepting yourself, completely. The monster and the man, the ruthless and the merciful, all of it integrated into something that didn't need empire to have value or title to have worth. Just breath. Presence. The choice each moment to be slightly less terrible than you'd been before. That was the lesson. The one that cost everything to learn and couldn't be taught any other way except through total destruction and slow reconstruction. And as the sun climbed higher over the Scottish coast, Cedric Thorne closed his book and began another ordinary day in an extraordinary life he'd built from the ashes of everything he'd lost. Not happy, not healed, not whole, but here, present, alive. And that finally was enough.